Hey, my friends, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. We're working our way through the book of Matthew, one little bit at a time every weekday morning. We're all the way up to Matthew chapter 12. All that took was like a year and 200 and some odd episodes. No, really, we're making progress, and I think we're making progress at a completely acceptable clip for what our relationship is here. And I know that you have so many other things that you can be doing with your time. I know that there are 500,000 new podcasts that got released in the last few months. I know that you're under all kinds of pressure with things clamoring for your attention. And yet, once again, here we are, hanging out, talking about this thing that is timeless, that covers this huge span of history, that has a knack for making the things that are demanding our attention, that feel terribly urgent and frantic. It has a knack for putting those things in perspective and giving us a bigger look at human existence, at God, at creation, at us, at our lives, at what happens during our lifetimes, at what happens after our lifetimes. I think there's something beautifully perspective-giving about all of this, and I'm so grateful to you by the sheer merit of your interest and existence and willingness to listen and make this a habit, that you have built this into my life in a new way. So thank you for hanging out with me. Thank you that we get to do this together. Last time around, we were talking about, speaking of big, giant, sweeping historical stories that put everything in perspective in terms of time and urgency, we were talking about how the Jewish law of what we call the Old Testament went from being a written thing, that covers a pretty good chunk of pages here, to a sprawling law that goes beyond what is written and into the realm of debate and rhetoric and this oral tradition that comes to be viewed as just as binding as that written law in the minds of so many of the fellow countrymen of Jesus at the time that he's around, in what we're looking at, in this case, in Matthew chapter 12. So we have a legal showdown that is emerging in Matthew 12, starting in verse 1. It says, "At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some of the heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees," these are the religious leaders, "saw this, they said to him, 'Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath.'" And last time around, we started to piece together the roots and foundations of this controversy by looking at this big story and noting that in the early to mid-ish 500s BC, the Persians conquered the Babylonians. The Babylonians had owned the Jewish people at this point. And the Persians are like, "No, we're not doing that stuff. You all can just go home. You can rebuild your walls and your God temple thing, and you can mostly govern yourselves. Good luck." And so a bunch of the Jewish people take them up on it, and they go home and they rebuild things. And then this tradition begins, and the leaders of the Jewish people in that moment are overcome with this impulse to say, "Whoa, we are getting a second chance here. Okay, we blew it. We got sideways and fumbly as a people. We did strange, dark things, and as a result, God did what he said he was going to do. He punished us through the force of other nations. But now we have a chance to rebuild this thing, and we got to make sure that not just as a few individuals, but as a people, we nail it this time. We need to obey God and do all the things that he would want, and we need to go even over the top of his own rules into duplicate and triplicate and quadruplicate layers of rules to keep us from ever actually even tiptoeing close to breaking one of the actual rules." And so again, by the time of Jesus, then you've got this whole expanded legal tradition that seems very nitpicky from the outside looking in. No, it just is very nitpicky. I'm just trying to be empathetic to the historical impulses and pressures that caused people to create this very nitpicky set of rules. But what's interesting about it is there's this class that emerges in this Second Temple period that is the keeper of the laws, the keeper of legal memories. And they're elite because they own the law, they interpret the law. In a way, they can even make new law, and it's not written down at the time of Jesus. And if you're thinking to yourself, that seems like it would be a recipe for abuse and pride, well, you would be right. It looks like it was a recipe for abuse and pride, even if some of the historical motives behind it are really understandable. So what Jesus encounters is a bunch of rules that maybe are well-intentioned, but they're putting distance between people and God. And the whole point of everything about God making a chosen people and blessing the world and redeeming through his relationship with those chosen people was to get people closer to God and to rectify this gap that had occurred because of the fallenness of humanity between God and frail, finite people. So unsurprisingly, Jesus is opposed to a lot of this religious nitpickiness, and himself even effectively charges these keepers of the law with abuse and missing the point. So when we look back and try to piece together what all of these unwritten rules were about that Jesus kept running into, we get a gigantic assist from the circumstances of history. Again, the Jewish societal norms of this gigantic era that represents 2.5 times the total length of existence of the United States, all of that comes to an end in 70 AD. Everything changes with the Jewish rebellion, the Roman destruction of the Jewish rebellion, and the Roman destruction of that Second Temple. That is the one that was built in the 500s upon the Jewish return from exile in Persia, and that was expanded by Herod the Great a little bit before the time of Jesus. That temple gets wrecked, and then pretty quickly the whole temple culture goes away because, there isn't a temple, so there's nothing to rally around. That means that all the people who were the keepers of the law are going to start aging out and dying. They don't have this one singular central geographical religious hub to hang out in. And as a result, this long unwritten set of rules, and there were vaguely some reasons that were cited from the Torah and other oral traditions to say we don't write this law down. It is simply an oral legal tradition, but all of that has to change after 70 AD. You're now at a point where you can either write it down or it's going to age out and it's going to be lost. And because of that, we get a religious document that is hugely important to history and the history of philosophy and Judaism called the Mishnah. The Mishnah is a collection of arguments, a collection of treatises, of religious legal statements and decisions and renderings from the best minds of the Second Temple period that are gathered together and organized into a series of subdivisions that summarize all of this oral law, or, almost all of the areas of this oral law. Now, obviously, this curating process that leads to the summary of Jewish oral law that we call the Mishnah, it starts very close to the time of Jesus. So the Mishnah gives us a look into the legal world, the religious legal world of the time of Christ. And this Mishnah thing is going to be hugely important for you and me as we work our way through the rest of the book of Matthew and try to understand who Jesus is talking to and what the original audience's assumptions would have been. It's going to de-crazy a lot of the discussions that we're seeing happening, and it's going to sanify them and make it a lot easier to empathize with and genuinely understand the frictions that are driving this story. It's also going to help us genuinely understand what the God of the Bible is held out as actually wanting and being into. So in the Mishnah, you got this section on Sabbath stuff. You get this list of 39 melachot. I'm probably saying that wrong. I don't know. It's in the ballpark at any rate. And these are 39 types of work or activities that you can't do on the Sabbath. Now, this is genius. You start reading through this list and you figure out really quickly that these people had a lot of time to think through all of the middle school mindset ways to weasel around the rules that people could come up with. There is no weaseling here. Anything you could possibly do has been thought of and worked around so that, no, you are going to honor the Sabbath. You are going to honor God with this thing, and we are going to be in a state of national obedience so that God will bless us. So, for example, you've got the order of garments, which limits your Sabbath activities on the following things: shearing, scouring, laundering, carding, combing wool, dyeing, spinning, warping, making 2 loops, weaving, separating 2 threads, tying, untying, sewing, or tearing. Seriously, I defy you to try to think of something you could do with clothes that isn't somehow on that list. The order of construction gives us rules about writing, erasing, construction, demolition, extinguishing a fire, igniting a fire, final completion, fine-tuning, perfection, and a bunch of other things. And most relevant to our conversation about the disciples going through a field and rubbing some heads of grain together and eating them is this little nugget from chapter or section 7 of the Mishnah on the Sabbath. One who sows, and one who plows, and one who reaps, and one who gathers sheaves into a pile, and one who threshes, removing the kernel from the husk, and one who winnows threshed grain in the wind, like rubbing your hands together and letting the wind take it, and one who selects the inedible waste from the edible, and one who grinds, and one who sifts the flour in a sieve, and one who kneads dough, and one who bakes. All of those things in that language is prohibited. Now again, this was only an oral tradition at the time of the events described in Matthew chapter 12 with the disciples walking through this field, but apparently it was a very binding oral tradition, and it was pretty shocking that anyone would jeopardize the national fate of everything by doing such an irresponsible thing that clearly in the minds of those who were offended would be just flaunting the law of God, even though that's not actually the law of God that was written down, but I think you get that point now. So for about the 15th time in the last 2 or 3 chapters, we see a collision course. We see ratcheting tension as Jesus, who clearly views himself as being the fulfillment and completion of all of the impulses of the law that are actually from God, is coming into conflict with people who view themselves as the gatekeepers of a law that isn't even written down, and that if anybody wants to know what the actual law is, they would have to go and talk to them, and then they would get together with their other fancy legal-minded oral law keepers of the flame types and decide exactly how people ought to proceed. But clearly they were also the church ladies of the day who went around and figured out the thing that you were doing wrong and made sure that that was dealt with immediately, because we're just not going to tolerate any of these shenanigans. Well, you can't really square these two things. And if we understand the Mishnah and the laws and traditions that were very old, even by the time the Mishnah is being assembled, then we understand where the people who don't like Jesus very much are coming from. And if we consider the larger historical picture that we looked at in the last conversation, and if we consider the larger historical situation that we discussed in the last episode, then we even more so get not just where they're coming from, but why they're coming from there, or at least why they were coming from that perspective in the first place. But if we then go and look at the Sermon on the Mount, which you and I spent months on, we understand that Jesus is doing something different. Both of these things cannot be simultaneously right, no matter how much you or I might be that kind of person who wants to see a little bit of the truth in all the things and find a way to make the tensions go away and make everything just fit together in one big play nice sandbox. Sometimes stuff's a 1 or a 0, and it can't be both at the same time. This is one of those deals, and now, and only now, do I feel like we're ready to move into tomorrow's conversation and talk about Jesus' response to the charges the Pharisees just leveled at Jesus' disciples of breaking the law of the Sabbath. And we'll see where it goes tomorrow. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Really, seriously, thanks for hanging out with me, and let's do this again soon.